Hello. Welcome to Matters of DeCorum. I'm Scott Corum. This is what matters to me. One of the old tropes of original classic first edition Dungeons and Dragons is an encounter. One of the subsets of an adventure, a meeting, a situation, you encounter something. And the earliest memed encounter from Dungeons and Dragons that I can remember goes a little something like this. You enter a 10-foot by 10-foot room. In the center is a chest being guarded by an orc. What do you do? It's a simple scenario. You would recognize that from any number of computer games. It sounds like a bit from a D&D game, and it could absolutely be part of any larger scenario. 10-foot by 10-foot room. I'm currently sitting in a room that, despite appearances, is only a little bit larger than 10 foot by 10 foot, 100 square feet. It's not a lot of space. The chest probably has some treasure in it if the chest isn't actually a mimic that is guarding the orc. But chests, I've got actually a couple of chests right here. They take up a good 4 to 6 feet of floor space, 4 to 6 square feet there. An orc takes up a hex. Most medium-sized creatures take up 1 hex, 1 square, 1 inch that represents 5 feet. 5 feet to a side, 5 square, that's 25 square feet. Devoted to where that orc is standing, existing, moving, doing his stuff. That's a tight little adventure. And that particular scenario, first edition, I think it's either an example or part of the introduction or introductory adventure, does not explain some things that at the time I had no reason to believe needed an explanation. It seemed simple enough. Didn't matter who that chest originally belonged to. You were in a dungeon, you're an adventurer, that chest is yours if you can kill the orc. Didn't matter who the orc was working for, if it was the person who owned the chest or someone who wanted to steal the chest and they left the orc there to make sure no one else took it while they went to get keys or something. Where'd the orc come from? Is that a 24/7 orc? Does the orc get a time off? Is there something about the orcs that makes him able to stand there for weeks and months at a time, waiting for adventurers to come in and try and take their chest? These are questions that early map makers, early dungeon designers, early players and dungeon masters of Dungeons and Dragons didn't think that much about. You kill the monsters, you take the treasure, you get experience, you go up in levels, you can kill bigger monsters and get bigger treasures. Lather, rinse, repeat. There wasn't always some kind of a plot or story, and up to a point, that was fine. You remember the origins of Dungeons and Dragons as a war game, an overly complicated war game. Two guys show up, they've got their armies of painted lead, they set them out, there's rules for how they can move, and they set out strategic lines and roll dice to determine whether there's a chance of success or failure. They roll dice to see whether it was a success or a failure, and they wage a war. It could take a weekend or longer. And then a couple of luminaries started to codify, well, what happens when you're not out at a war, when it's only 4 or 5 people? What if they're not out on a field having a battle? What if they're in a dungeon or something, moving around square by square, finding treasure, fighting monsters? it evolved to its current state by steps, as did many of its players, me included. I think the first time I really got a grip on what a dungeon would really mean was a sidebar in the third edition GURPS fantasy book, where it talked about dungeon ecology. That orc standing by the chest, you can't stand there for 24 hours in a row. You don't want to exhaust your guards if you don't absolutely have to. You want them to take breaks so they can be alert, which means there's not one chest and one orc in that dungeon to watch that chest. There's ideally like 3 at a minimum, 2 if you're really, really pushing it, but you want to have 3 8-hour-ish shifts across a 24-hour day. And when they're not guarding that chest, it was nigh impossible for the dungeoneers your adventurers to find their way into this dungeon. There's not a footpath out for the orcs. They've got to stay in there. So let's say there's 3 orcs working 3 shifts. They need food, water, someplace to eliminate waste, a place to sleep. Maybe someplace that they can train while they're off duty. Some kind of diversion or entertainment. Orcs aren't, at least the typical original Dungeons and Dragons orc, not really known for their workman-like mentality. And now your dungeon is much larger, and you haven't gotten to more rooms with monsters and treasure in them yet. Now you're in a mess hall and a bunks and a barracks and a latrine. Your dungeon design has to include this offshoot. There's an employee break room or something, the equivalent. Another interesting influence on my knowledge of and perception of dungeons and their place in a fantasy world came from the role-playing game Paranoia. I learned a great many fascinating lessons from just reading the Paranoia books, much less playing and running it. But there is and it's a far future game. It's all paranoid, hiding from conspiracies while you're engaging in conspiracies, and it's fascinating stuff. But they had a module early on called Orc Busters, where they parodied Dungeons and Dragons tropes in the Paranoia, which is really, really well written. But there's an encounter in Orc Busters, a little over halfway through, where the players enter this room, and the characters see an orc and a troll and an ogre and a couple of kobolds sitting at a big round table playing cards. And there's an hourglass in the center of the table, and the hourglass runs out, and the monsters all look at it, and they kind of sigh, and the troll grabs the deck and shuffles it up and deals everyone a card. They all have a look at their cards, and the orc draws the low card. And okay, no one take my pot, and grabs his axe and heads out to a guard post. Congratulations, you just found the random monsters table. And that is brilliant, but that's also a stunning reflection of the kind of mechanics that most dungeons throw out right and left without thinking about them too much. And when I say most dungeons, I'm talking about a lot of early D&D dungeons. Occasionally you still find these out there, things that are much more like something generated by an ASCII dungeon than anything else, a computer program that randomly generates a dungeon, a rogue. random generated dungeon, and you're just represented by one character on the screen, and you're moving around killing monsters, and no story. There's no story. There's no plot. There's no background. Your character has no name. You're just wandering around. Well, you give your character a name, but you're just wandering around killing monsters until a monster kills you, and then the dungeon rewrites and starts over from scratch. That's not unlike a number of dungeons that I have played in that people wrote. One of the first things I did when I discovered Dungeons and Dragons was even a thing. One of the kids in my sixth grade class brought in a couple of books and a newspaper article on people playing this in college campuses. And I was fascinated. I was absolutely fascinated by it. I was fascinated by the maps. My mom went to an office supply store and found me a desk blotter. Nice big, but it was in graph paper. It was in standard rule graph paper. So there was these thousands of little squares on this sheet of graph paper that I had a tablet of. You could rip one off and go to the one beneath it. I made maps and dungeons. I designed brand new traps, none of which were actually practical. I populated them with huge rooms full of monsters. I was not writing good D&D dungeons. I was not writing a good dungeon for any fantasy game. This was a computer game. I didn't encounter architecture like I had designed in sixth grade on my graph paper blotter until I started playing a game called Marathon by Bungie, one of the early ones that you only find for the Macintosh. Well, there are ports out there now, but this is back in the late 90s, early 2000s, and I would be going through these maze-like corridors and these rooms that have little to no explanation, and every so often there'd be a room that's just packed full of monsters. Yeah. Find a secret door, a door opens up, and there's like 20 monsters standing around in a room with space for 20 monsters. And those were difficult encounters, but that was a video game. Even early video games had this, it doesn't need to make sense. You're here to kill monsters and get experience. It took a while to get out of that mindset. I'm very grateful to modern approaches to Dungeons and Dragons. Groups that I have started D&D with or joined up with in more recent years, I've had a better sense of story and plot and background and meaning and actually having these fleshed out experiences. These experiences that are a little bit more complete because they are a little bit more in depth. You're not killing the bad guys, taking their stuff, lather, rinse, repeat. Your average convention game, as I was coming to this point, I had to evaluate some adventures that were written for tournaments while I was working for Strategicon. And we got an adventure that was literally Save the Princess. Not the most progressive adventure, not the most progressive DM, so I guess that counts. But a princess has been kidnapped by an evil baron. Go get the princess back. Get the reward from the king. And not only was it not complicated, but the dungeon master had included this bit, this couple of paragraphs on if the adventurers decide not to return the princess to the king, here are the steps the king will take and who the king will send after the adventurers. Technically, the adventuring party could get more experience by killing the orcs, keeping the princess, and then killing the champions the king sent after them, because the champions were a match for the party on a 1-by-1-to-1 basis. But if the entire party ganged up on the champions, as D&D parties are wont to do, they'd take them out pretty easily, and they were worth a lot of experience, and the stuff that they were equipped with was worth a tremendous amount of gold. The best strategy was to not complete the adventure, but to go off the rails, keep the princess for whatever purpose, maybe sell her someplace, and kill the king's champions. And without champions, the king would be ripe for being kicked off the throne. So if it worked out that way, that the adventurers took over the kingdom, I mean, that's kind of a win on that side of the table, wouldn't you think? Not that I did much better when I designed a dungeon the next year, because I had this beautiful. I went story, I went layout, I went plot, I went way, way too deep. None of the parties got anywhere near finishing it. Half the parties had experience points deducted from their total because they took the wrong actions and murdered a whole bunch of innocent villagers who could not defend themselves because they thought that was what they needed to do. I refuse to take credit for that problem. That's all on them. It's funny that more than one group decided to do that. I went too far, and that's another risk when you're doing this, is that you've got so much invested in the time and background that it just kind of collapses under its own weight. There's a balance. Somewhere between, you walk into a 10 foot by 10 foot room, in the center is a chest being guarded by an orc, and the festival of the Dracolich Aikuwaran, who has co-opted an entire cult of orcs who have tied up and starved this entire village of food. Can you go save your mentor? That was a bit much. I could run it now, but I'd have to rewrite it to be a little bit more accessible. Somewhere between there is the sweet spot. And I know how to find this sweet spot. And I'm going to share that secret with you now. The secret to finding the sweet spot while you're designing your adventure is that you don't have it. You do not have the sweet spot of the adventure. You can try writing it for days and weeks, and you might be able to write a situation that comes pretty close to what you're looking for, but the sweet spot's on the other side of the table. The sweet spot is with your players. I haven't used a pre-published adventure for quite some time. I've used pre-published material. I've used other people's published materials, supplementary, but not their adventures. Because there's no adventure I have found that is as satisfying ultimately as what your group of gamers sitting at the table with you decide to do with what you have given them as an adventure. There is no more random or destructive force in the universe than a table full of player characters. That's just how it goes. And if you underwrite that dungeon, if you've got a 10 foot by 10 foot room with a chest being guarded by an orc, with no infrastructure and no background, and you're just assuming that everything's that you're gonna kill the monsters, take the experience, and move on, your party is going to read into that. There's going to be a lot more stuff there that you never planned. They'll tell you why that orc doesn't need to take breaks. Oh my god, was that an immortal orc? Are we facing an orc vampire and he's just toying with us? That's not a terrible idea. It's not a terrible idea. Your party will find that background and meaning if you give them the leverage to do so. If your only answer is nope, 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 there's nothing else here. There's no infrastructure. There's no other orcs. It's just that one orc watching that chest 24/7. If that's your answer, then you're done. That's about the best you can do. But if you give your players that freedom to create a little bit. Now, I don't know. Give me a perception check. Let's see what we can find out about this orc. Give me insight. See if you can garner things. Oh, you're a dwarf. I'll give you a bonus to that because there's some writing on the walls. You throw a little something. You throw an opportunity for them to find something. And then you make something up and it doesn't need to make a lick of sense. Not a lick. This orc had red eyes. This orc had one tusk. This orc has a magic ring in his pouch that he wasn't wearing. I wonder why. You want to cast Identify? It's going to take you a little while. You hear rustling down the hallway. What's going on? You throw him a little something. You throw him a MacGuffin. You throw him a clue. As we learned from Scooby-Doo, all good things start with clues. You throw him a clue, and you don't need to know what that clue is to. You have no need to know what that means, because your party will figure it out. They will start throwing out ideas, and you will sit back and nod sadly. Oh yeah, that could be it. That would have been brilliant, but no, it's not it. But keep going. I think you're getting close, and they will give you the best explanation and lead that to the best adventure. I have in the past started adventures with a simple setup. There's a barn being overrun by something. The farmer's paying good money for it. He thinks he's lost one of his cows. Why don't you go see what you can do about that? The farmer's offering to pay you like 5 silver apiece for a first level adventurer. That's not bad. Okay, let's go have a look at this. And then through a series of not having any idea what's going on and explaining as little as you possibly can, or you explain the giant rats in great detail and the fight's a beautiful cinematic thing, but then at the end, what were the rats doing here? Where'd they come from? I don't know. Want to give me a roll on that? Investigation. Investigation's a good skill. Why don't you give me a roll on that? Always make it sound like you've got a plan, because your players usually expecting you to have a plan. Even mine sometimes expect me to have a plan, which is amazing. And sound like you have a plan, sound confident in your answers, and if it doesn't spark your imagination, then that can go. But the whole table has more imagination than you do alone. And tap that. Those are people who are sitting there engaged to be a part of a story, to contribute part of a story to the table. Maybe my parties tend to contribute more to the story than they think they are. I have NPCs I can throw out. I've got a book full of random magic item tables. Roll some dice and give them an answer that leaves some more questions. Because I've been to 10-foot by 10-foot orc and chest land, and I've been to overwritten entire empire founded against the party with an entire new pantheon of gods and pages of lore that never get used. And somewhere in the middle is wing it. First couple of times, it's a little rough, and you might be nervous because, well, they're looking at you like you know stuff, and you don't know stuff. So what do? It gets easy after a little while. You practice it. I run games at conventions, and that grinder of you've got 4 hours and 6 players every 4 hours. You got to run them through an adventure, get them in, get them characters, get them out, get the adventure done, roll the dice, done. Next group. And it's a meat grinder, but oh wow, the stuff you pick up. Because when you run for that many different kinds of people, that many different minds, that many different imaginations, and they're all looking for something different, you learn fast. And maybe you don't have access to that kind of a grind. Although, volunteering to run games at a local convention with role-playing games at it, not a terrible way to go about it. They can always use more events, and it's a great way to hone your skills. But that improv dungeon, that dungeon where you start with a scrap of lore, a spot on a map, a hastily researched Google image search of dungeons near water. And you throw that up and you take folks through it. And you don't answer a damn question. You don't have to answer a single damn question before you start. And you let them discover those questions the same way their characters are, and you are on that journey of discovery with them. All you're doing is judging their input and selecting the winner, maybe juggling a few different answers around to put something together that is different from anything suggested, but along those lines. Man, that was really close. That's I didn't think anyone would figure it out this fast. That's really good. Have some extra experience. That is magic. That creates an adventure where none existed. And the next time you have that group or a different group in a similar situation, well, now you've got a little bit more lore. Lore that you didn't write, that you didn't get out of a book, lore that is meaningful and personal to the people at that table, whether they know it or not, because they wrote it. Well, thank you for following me along on this particular ramble. This is stuff that I have said before. I'm trying to say it in a different way. I'm going to be writing a book about this stuff before too much longer, I think. And I might be assembling some of my thoughts and putting my notes into a more codified form. Would you be interested in a book like that on playing, dungeon mastering, and writing? Give me a comment down below and let me know. In the meantime, thank you very much for following me along on this particular ramble. I'm Scott Corum. This is what has mattered to me. I will see you next time on the next Matters of DeCorum. And now over to Uncle Drac for the outro. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't enjoy this video, give it a thumbs down. Feedback is feedback. If there's any other topics you would like to hear Scott talk about, questions you'd like him to answer, subjects you'd like him to cover, please leave a comment down below. He will love getting your comment and you will love leaving him one. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, why not? This channel is awesome. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button. If you do, you might also want to hit the little notification bell so you're alerted when these videos become available. If you would like to support this channel in a more substantial manner, we invite you to hit us up at the Patreon page, www.patreon.com/ScottCorum. And consider donating. Absolutely anything helps and allows us to create better content more often. In the meantime, thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.